Real quick, so we want to do two things today.
11:30. And we have to get you to be out.
We have a lot of time.
So hard as
So if we want to talk about the black laws again, then we want to move directly and then we'll wrap it up. So, as you might have guessed, I'm asking you to see the United States from the perspective of its mirror. We have been talking about the mirror, about who we are. And I want to add a couple of more things to that. And we'll talk about what happens to the mirror. Because something happens to the mirror. And the black laws is, or are one of those things that happen to the mirror. So I want to take a look quickly at Chief Justice William Cushing. His name is on the screen. We mentioned Quank Walker the other day. This black man who was held in slavery. He was promised his freedom. His original owner died. That person's wife remarried. The new owner would not let him go, battered him. Quank Walker sued in Massachusetts. And this case eventually worked its way to the state Supreme Court in Massachusetts. And Chief Justice William Cushing, the presiding judge, delivered an opinion in this case. Now, when we talked about Levi, Anthony Levi yesterday, some people said, well, he's a lawyer. He's arguing the case for his client. We can't believe what he said. But here is the Chief Justice making a ruling in this particular case. Real quick, will someone read it for me? Quickly. Marissa, would you read it for me, please?
A different idea has taken place with the people of America, more favorable to the natural rights of mankind, and to that natural innate desire for liberty, with which heaven, without regard to color, complexion, or shape of the nose features, has inspired all the human race.
Okay, take a look at that for 1 minute. And I want one person in one sentence to tell me what they take from this. This is the Chief Justice. Anyone volunteer? Anyone who wants to volunteer? What do you take from this? Yes?
In the eyes of God, we're all the same.
I'm sorry.
I said, in the eyes of God, we're all the same.
Okay, sorry. Any report? Continue reading for me, Tony.
People of this Commonwealth have solemnly bound themselves, sets out with declaring that all men are born free and equal, and that every subject is entitled to liberty, and to have it guarded by the laws, as well as life and property, and in short, is totally repugnant to the idea of being born slaves.
Okay, please take a look at this. I want to volunteer to tell me what you take from this. Yes, Catherine.
We all deserve freedom.
And Fernando, would you read this for me, please?
Slavery is inconsistent with our conduct and constitution, and there can be no such thing as perpetual servitude of a rational.
Okay. I need a volunteer. What do you get from this?
Are you looking at me?
Yes.
Okay. That slavery goes against the natural order of things, that you can't put someone in servitude forever if they are of sound mind.
This case, Commonwealth versus Jefferson, put Massachusetts on the path to freedom in 1783. And then in 1787, the Continental Congress, not the Congress that was created, adopted the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Now, before we talk about this, I want to say just briefly, Thomas Jefferson chaired the committee on the Western Territory in 1784. And Jefferson's committee called for, as many of you probably know, abolishing slavery in the Western Territory by 1800. All kind of problems with that. But don't ignore the fact that Jefferson's committee called for abolishing slavery in the entire Western Territory in 1784. Congress did not approve it, but at least this is a part of the record. 3 years later, Congress adopted the Northwest Ordinance, and its 6th article has this clause. Will someone read it for me?
There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said Northwest Territory.
Jeff, what do you make of that?
Slavery is banned in the Northwest Territory.
Okay, and historians make a big deal of a lot of things. We're not going to talk about that, but I mean, it's pretty clear. The language is pretty clear. Slavery should not exist in the Northwest Territory. Following this, Ohio adopted its constitution in 1803. Would someone please read the first clause for me? Someone who has not spoken since I've been here.
There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in this state.
Is that clear to you? The second clause, please. Anyone? Go ahead, Christine.
No alteration of this Constitution shall ever take place so as to introduce slavery or involuntary servitude.
Yes.
Even as punishment for a crime?
Now, that, of course, punishment for crime would be considered. If a person is prosecuted for a crime, they could be held in jail. So these laws do not do anything like that. All right, much can be said about this, but what I want you to see, though, is that we're not just talking about empty phrases of equality, natural rights. Something began to happen in the states, and these are examples of this. But not only Ohio, other states, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, all of these states adopted laws against slavery. But then something happened. And I think I'm going to go back to get to that clause. Okay. So we're talking about the mirror. When the mirror shines, when the mirror is clean, rights of people are protected. Mirrors become dirty, become foggy. And I say we try to keep the mirror clean. So this is really the basis of my optimism, is that this is a mirror that needs to be clean. And the mirror became dirty, unclean, starting in Ohio in the early 19th century. We introduced these yesterday. We have the Black Laws book, I'm pleased about that. And I want to talk briefly about some of these laws. Immigration law. Did anyone take a look at this law in the book? Does anyone have a sense of what this law meant? Now, they didn't call it immigration law per se. This is what I'm kind of coining to make it accessible. Did anyone get a sense of what this law suggested? Anyone get a sense of that? But what they're doing is that they are placing conditions on the migration of Black Americans into Ohio. So what they're saying is that Black Americans needed to demonstrate their free status as a condition for entry. They needed to produce some type of certificate of freedom or some type of affidavit that showed that they were free. And they needed to file the certificate or affidavit with the clerk of court in the county where they lived. This is the point of the law. The law applied only to Black Americans, to no one else. The mirror, if you're following me, was not clean. In addition to this, the immigration law wanted to add, because the legislature modified it, because Black Americans continue to come into Ohio. So they modified it by adding a bond law. And the bond law required Black Americans to post a bond for $500 as a condition for them entering Ohio. Now this bond did not mean, this is why it's called bond law, it did not mean, Katie, that a Black person needed to produce $500. What they needed to do was to find 2 freeholders who would vouch for them and post a bond, that is to say that they have a bond reserved for $500 in the event that this person became destitute or this person committed some type of crime and was liable then the freeholder would be liable for that person. Now, critics of the law said that the intent of it obviously was to prevent Black Americans from coming in, because most people at the time, regardless of what their ancestry was, were not able to come in with $500. So the bond law was really prohibitive to keep Black Americans out. Any comments or questions about the immigration law? Eric?
I'm just curious about the repayment of the bonds. How long did that, what was that term?
Yeah, that was not specified in that statute. But but the bond is only repayable if the bond is forfeited. That is, if a person from hard times, or if a person committed some type of crime and the bond was actually needed. So the bond is simply in reserve. It's not something that's taken from. Oh, by the way, hundreds of names were filed in registers in counties throughout Ohio when Black Americans from various states came in, went to county clerks, signed their names, presented certificates that they were free. And those records are still available for inspection.
Do we know how many, I mean, has anybody actually done the empirical research?
Actually, yeah, kind of all up. Yeah, no, I don't know if anyone who has. I didn't, but surely a few thousand.
Right.
It's still available.
You know, it's kind of curious, apropos of our current immigration situation. My guess would be that only a fraction of the free Blacks who moved to Ohio actually registered. Would that be your sense of it?
That's exactly right.
So there's a lot of illegal aliens.
Yeah, you know, the idea was that that state didn't intend to enforce the law. The state was sending a message, so they just couldn't enforce that law. Okay. So the next one that I want you to look at is the residency law. A little different. Immigrate, got to have a certificate of residency. You need a certificate to remain here. And there was no like time period on this. So an African American, a Black American who came into Ohio in 1810, if he was there in 1820 and there was no certificate and people were clear about this, they could be expelled. And if you check the Black Law book, you'll see a riot in Cincinnati in 1829 when whites actually drove out a lot of Black Americans from Ohio, claiming that they did not have a certificate. Residency law, it was really an opportunity, critics said, for whites to expel Blacks whenever they felt they needed to do so. Testimony law. Any thoughts? Testimony law. That's also mentioned in the Black Law. In newspapers called it the Negro Evidence Law. What it said was that a Black American could not offer testimony in a court of law against any white person. And if you look at the first few pages of my book, I talk about it. I think this individual's name is Charles. He and his brother, one of them was killed. Someone witnessed the crime because they were Black. Their testimony was inadmissible in any court in Ohio. The testimony law, Negro evidence law, militia law, only whites could serve in the militia. We also have the public school law. Schools were reserved for whites only. Now, this became problematic because the question becomes, well, who is white? What if a person with African ancestry was the offspring of a mixed couple? And what if that person married or got together with a white person and their offspring is one generation removed? The law, the Black laws only subordinated Blacks and mulattoes. And the legal definition of a mulatto came into question. This legal definition said that a mulatto is someone who is half white and half Black. So what about a person then who is the son or daughter of a mulatto? Then the courts then began to ask the question, well, who is white? Well, they began to say that a person could be legally white if they were more than 50% Black. And that became a subject of controversy for the courts of Ohio into the 1850s. So these are some of the Black laws. Now, we keep the mirror clean, right? Is the mirror clean now with the passage of the Black laws? No. What do you suppose Americans did in Ohio they began to resist the black laws. And my book talks about the petitioning movement. We kind of began to show movements in Ohio, movements led by black Americans who were college educated, many of them. Oberlin College was there. Ohio University began to admit black Americans. Some black Americans were educated out of state. Those individuals began to resist the black laws, and then whites joined them in attempting to keep the mirror clean. And this petitioning movement was launched. The state legislature received several of them. Ultimately, though, it was not the legislature that responded to the petitions, which you'll see in my book, is that by 1848, in a disputed election, Salmon Chase and other Republicans brokered a deal. Salmon and Free Soil Party, Republican Party, and the Democratic Party. The disputed election in Ohio, 1848. And the deal was, that the Republicans would join. My recollection of this is a bit old, but the point is that there was a political compromise, and they agreed to repeal many of the black laws. Many of them were repealed in 1848, and by 1845 they also agreed to create a school system for black children. 1848 was the very first time public school was created for black children in the state of Ohio, and that was a part of this compromise for the partial repeal of the black laws.
This was a segregated system?
Segregated system, because they had to do this because the offsprings of biracial couples were contending that they were white and eligible for entry into white schools. Now, there were some integrated schools in small districts in Ohio before 1850 where they only had enough resources and children for one school, but for the most part, those schools were segregated. And so a child, there's a big case called Van Camp versus Ohio. Enos Van Camp, he felt that he was socially white, his children were accepted in the community, he thought his children should be able to go. This was 1859. After the segregated school system was created, he thought that his children should be able to go to the white schools. The court then, as I see it, set up a way to determine whether a person is white or not, regardless of their complexion. Does anyone know what that is? Has anyone ever seen a light-skinned, very light biracial person, but then you say, So what do you suppose the test would be? If a person is white or not? What was that? Ashadi?
The paperback test, or the one-drop rule?
Yep. Well, yeah, that's developing in the culture. This one-drop rule, Sade, is developing in the culture. And they began to look at acceptance. Not only performance, but also acceptance. So if someone is accepted, you go to church, you're accepted as white, you go to social events, you're accepted as white, then the idea was that whites knew other whites. And if the person is socially accepted, allowed to perform their whiteness, then that person was considered to be white. The court began to move toward that. So the court therefore concluded with Enos Van Camp's children that they were not socially accepted. Therefore, they were not white. And a black school was available to them. And some of the gains of mulattoes, biracial kids, before 1850 were taken away. We don't have time to explore all of those. But anyway, black laws and many more. Connecticut adopted black laws. Connecticut, 1833. Prudence Randall, young woman who wanted to establish a school. First of all, she wanted to establish a school for white children only. And then there was a black girl who showed up at the school. She wanted an education. She asked Crandall if she could enroll in the school. Prudence allowed her, and the community began to revolt. Connecticut legislature passed a black law saying that children who were black could not enter schools with whites in the community where Crandall taught.
Quick question, but this was a private school or a public?
It was a private school. This was a private school, funded by the donors in an area that withhold their money because Crandall was admitting. Now, younger children weren't allowed to go to those schools. Crandall was teaching, I would say, teenagers to So why do you think the community would have objected against black teenagers attending school with a black child?
That's when you're hormonal.
What was that?
Yeah.
You're hormonal.
Hormonal, and you're also at this age where, we'll talk about some of this at some point when we do with Frederick Douglass, where conditioning is really taking place. So therefore, a 13-year-old, trying to say that we separate the races, if you're like a 13, 14, 15-year-old to accept this type of socialization, it's unlikely that they'll be able to drop it later on. So therefore, they're not going for older kids to get together, even though they were willing to allow like 6-year-old, 7-year-old kids to get together, because this conditioning will take force a little later. Indiana adopted black laws. Illinois adopted black laws. And as the country began to expand, going west, states west of the Mississippi River also began to adopt black laws, restraining blacks from participation with whites. This is what the Black Law book actually does. It talks about some of this. I talk about a white-black, alliance whereby people who shared the view that the mirror needs to be clean, undermine those black laws. Any comments? Okay, real quick, I think there is one other thing I want to do, then we'll go on to Frederick Douglass. See one thing. Because I, in my work, in my teaching, I don't want to just leave, and you can decide what you do with this. I don't want to just leave people with, the repressive laws of the past. I don't want to say, this is a training that I want to give you. So on the screen that I'm suggesting, that I want to, I'm thinking about how do people lead? How do we lead? Because we can lead in a way that causes friction. We can be anachronistic, we can be retrogressive in the way that we lead. I like to innovate new ways. I try to find new ways to encourage people to collaborate like they did in Ohio. Please help me find that slide in my notes. And I'll make one more comment, and I'll turn to you and see if you have anything to say, and we'll call it quits for today. We want to create a new FOSSI that benefits all people. My favorite phrase, and you can decide what you want to say about this, is the benefit of all. So whether you're Hispanic coming into this country, like those Hispanic children, it's really a shame that America, has, I'm going to call it imprisoned these children. Whether you're coming from Asia, whether you're coming from the West Indies or any other place, I'm thinking of a society that benefits all. Not a perfect society, because mirrors do not always stay clean. But we need to go back to some standard. And I think the standard is rooted in the phrase that I like, in the intelligence of nature. And when Jefferson talked about the laws of nature, nature's God, I think he's talking about this intelligence of nature. Go back to the mirror. We want the mirror to be clean, and that's where I try to labor. To train people to challenge old views, to train people to stop hearkening back to this old legality, train people to stop using the past, because this is what we do to verify knowledge today. A new type of way of thinking, a new type of condition. So, any final thoughts on the black laws? We'll move on to Frederick Douglass. Any final thoughts? Anyone? Any thoughts?
Can I ask what a second? I'm sorry.
Yes, Sam.
Well, I'm just curious, when you're studying the black laws, I think they're all very unusual and obviously harmful and hurtful and all of those things. But was there ever one that really stood out to you as, this is just flippin' bizarre? Like, why on earth?
Yeah, the testimony law, the judicial system. A person could, and not only, we're talking about murder. A person could witness a black person being murdered, and their testimony was not admissible. And that was horrifying to me. And the same applies to other things like theft and the like. Yes.
So if a white person killed a white person and the black person was the only witness, they couldn't testify?
Black could not testify, no.
So
They were not, their testimony was considered, the idea is like legitimacy. Their testimony would affirm their legitimacy as citizens. To deny their testimony what you're doing is affirming that they were residents, the way the legislature saw it, they were residents of Ohio, but they did not have a stake in Ohio. It's a lot like, you have existence, but nothing more than that. Katie?
I was thinking it wasn't about their ability to tell the truth,
No,
their ability to recall events.
No, that wasn't it at all.
Yeah.
It's just that they were not considered trustworthy witnesses, not because they did not have a firm grasp of anything. It's just because they didn't want to recognize their status as people.
So my students are very interested when we talk about these laws, in all parts of the country. And I'm also wondering, were there ever laws that were gender specific, or did they differentiate between black men and black women, or were these just specific for this group, or?
Not in these laws, but I think there were some laws concerning divorce that were gender specific, but not, they were not restricted to blacks. So therefore, a male could file for divorce for something like, you pick a thing, and a female would not. So there are certainly some gender specific laws. Okay, any other comments? Same way, you said.
Well, yeah, because I asked you to look at James Fortin's letters from Maryland College. What is he writing about there? These are very public letters.
Well, it's a very similar law to the passed in Ohio, putting conditions on the migration of blacks into Pennsylvania. So one of the requirements was you need to register if you want to migrate, and if you did that, then you could be fined to be sold into slavery, even if you came into the States as a free black.
Well, not that you can be sold into slavery, but
I didn't know the context there, but I think it
Right.
says sold. This was one of the possible consequences.
So he doesn't explain that entirely fully, but it's very close to that. The slave states that border, particularly Maryland, but also Virginia and, those are the two main states. They're constantly petitioning the legislatures of Pennsylvania to pass laws. And it's these laws. They want the legislature of Pennsylvania to pass their own black laws. And in particular, they want to make sure that the fugitives who run across the Mason-Dixon line are not just employed, which is what is happening. They're going into communities and they're hiring out and being their own masters. They don't want that. They want any stranger to be immediately advertised as a runaway. In other words, they want Pennsylvania to do the proxy work for them. And they want, by the way, not just Pennsylvania to do this, but they want New York to do it. Any place there's a port. They want Delaware to do it, they want New Jersey to do it, and they petition all of these legislatures for these laws. So does that comport with what you read now? Does that make sense? So they're not suggesting we're going to reinvent slavery in Pennsylvania. What they're doing is saying, we're going to advertise you, and if your master comes and claims you, we're going to let them take you back. So this is a set of laws that Pennsylvania might have passed. And this is where I think, if you're talking about, and I think this connects to your point, if you're talking about the history of this, it's one thing to collect all of the black laws and say, oh my God, what an awful racialized system of law. And that conclusion is not wrong. But what does this suggest here? Because this law is not passed. This law is not passed. And these were some of the most celebrated letters published and republished in the Pennsylvania papers. They're letters aimed directly at the Pennsylvania legislators. What are the arguments that he makes? Oh, yes.
One of the things I found really compelling was his willingness to say that there are good black people and bad black people. And if you're a bad person, you should be punished. If you are breaking the law, you should be subject to those laws. We're not saying that just because, based on the color of your skin, you should have any different rules than anyone else. We just want to be treated like everyone else. If I break the law or can't take care of myself or do any of those things, I should be subject to the same thing everyone else does. And I thought that was compelling because he's not asking for special treatment, he's asking for the same treatment.
That's good. And so if you look at some of the petitions, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, another argument that he uses Jefferson's words, all men are created equal, but then he goes into specifics. Yes, that means black people and Indians and everybody.
That's right. Go back to the mirror, right? Look, without the mirror, black Americans or anyone else would not have a chance in this country. You got to go back to the mirror. This is where our best argument is at.
I think what I agree with it also is that he repeatedly reinforces the humanity of blacks. Like he talks about the brotherhood, like just keeps in my dress. I feel for my brother just as a white man might feel for his brother. And so why aren't we family?
So that picks up, we talked about obliquely about reason in argument, right? Emphasizing equality as a fundamental idea of law. For a legal rule to work, it has to work both ways. It cannot just be a rule for some and not others, right? So there's this principle that he keeps coming back to. He comes back to the Declaration of Independence, but also the sentiment, right? This sentimental pull. There's this common humanity. So there's a sentimental argument in here as well.
Yeah, just one thing I add, he says in the second letter that it goes against the 9th article of the Constitution of Pennsylvania. So he references state law. The Constitution says similar to the Declaration, all men are equally free and independent and have certain inherent and indefeasible rights. And he goes on to say that if that's in the Constitution of the state, then this potential law can coexist peacefully with that Constitution.
Yeah. So this is a very sophisticated set of letters. James Forten was a very smart man and a very good constitutional thinker. He's all over the newspapers. Just to be clear, like, this is somebody organizing, constantly communicating. He's a leader in his community. This is a very, very important person. And these ideas had a lot of sway. And one thing that I have found, and I have not yet published this, but I'm working on getting it out. In 1826, the Pennsylvania legislature, they actually passed in 1820 the anti-kidnapping law, which is a very strong civil rights bill. In 1826, they passed a compromise measure. So it actually relaxes some of the standards from the 1820 law. I won't go into the specifics right now, but in 1826, when they're putting this bill forward, and they're arguing, there are people in the Pennsylvania legislature who are arguing against the bill's passage. And the argument that the abolitionists put forward is essentially James Forten's argument. They come back to equality, they come back to all of these principles. Some of them are genuinely generic. They can be traced to the same legal sources, but they follow a very eerie parallel. So I think I think what we see with James Forten is a concerted, lifetime of fighting against these kinds of laws. And we see success. They defeat the black laws in Pennsylvania, and they get what's called the personal liberty law in 1826 that becomes the model for personal liberty laws that are passed across the North. There is a tide that turns, in other words. If the black laws all come into being, there is a fight against it, and we start to see the repeal of some black laws. Professor Middleton certainly talks about this in Ohio and the political process that creates it. But we also see other laws that are pushing towards equality. Right about the time that abolitionists say, you know what, let's just have equal rights. This is an ongoing conversation, in other words. And as history, if you're teaching it as history, I think that's important. None of this is settled in any way. It is a constant political process back and forth. So I don't want to detract too much from talking about Frederick Douglass, but I did want to use that as a segue, because this is somebody who was important in the era right before Frederick Douglass. Anything else about those letters? I'm sorry.
The question is, why is it that we know Frederick Douglass and not James Forten? I mean, in your opinion, what is it about Forten that makes him not as...
I think John has an answer to that. Or maybe I do.
He was a machine. Frederick Douglass was his own biggest AR publicist. He was on the circuit constantly. He wrote three autobiographies about himself. Like, you can't be, and then he did a greatest hits right before he died, where he talked about his stories and recapped all his best speeches. Other people, most people were
guest in the White House.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he had all these honorary positions, and that's why we know
one thing to that. I think it's a really good point, but I think there's also the fact that the abolitionists at that point had such a big press dedicated to it that he had more venues available for publication. Forten did not.
He had his own press.
Yeah.
He also died in 1842, so it was a mature. Yeah.
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 Mm-hmm.
I'll consider that an answer.
Yeah.
Did you notice any similarities then, perhaps? Or differences? Maybe that's a good way to put it. You've read a little bit of Fort now. You've hopefully read the autobiography more than once. Everybody should read David Blight, the Yale scholar who writes. He says he reads the autobiography at least every other year in its entirety. Just sit down and read it. You read it. It is a great piece of American
Did you say
literature.
why?
No, I don't think so. He was just talking at the time. So I read it every other year. That's something about dinner. I don't know.
So if you're willing, I would love to hear from them about their impressions, what one or two things you take away from the autobiography. I'd love to hear from you.
One of the things for me is how, and this is in My Bondage and My Freedom, I'm not sure if it's in this autobiography, you know, the second of three. But when he talks about when he's in Baltimore and I think it's Ald, the master's wife is teaching him to read, and when the husband discovers it, he's furious. But Douglass, I like the way he kind of twists everything. That he's like, why is he so mad? I have to learn to read now. If this guy is so mad and upset, that there must be something really powerful in this. So I use that with my students, like, there's really something powerful in education, kind of thing. That he was so hungry to learn because he knew there was power in it.
That's wonderful. I love that. And that's, just
One of the parts that really jumped out at me, and I believe it's when he's in Baltimore, he talks about how at first the master's wife was nice, but how being a slave owner took this like nice decent person and then transformed her into something cruel. So I thought it was interesting that he touched on how slavery, being a master, slavery changes the owners as well. That was how I put it.
very good. I'm going to ask Mary Reed to read this for me. Just read it. He talks about what she's talking about and what Matthew just says.
Mr. Auld found out what was going on, and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his own words further, he said, if you give a nigger an inch, he will take an ell. A nigger should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best nigger in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that nigger, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at the time I least expected it. Whilst I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction which, by merest accident, I had gained from my master. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn how to read. The very decided manner with which he spoke and strove to impress his wife with the evil consequences of giving me instruction served to convince me that he was deeply sensible of the truths he was uttering. It gave me the best assurance that I might rely with the utmost confidence in the results which, he said, would flow from teaching me to read. What he most dreaded, that I most desired. What he most loved, that I most hated. That which to him was a great evil to be carefully shown was to me a great good to be diligently sought. And the argument which he so warmly urged against my learning to read only served to inspire me with a desire and determination to learn. In learning to read, I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress. I acknowledge the benefit of both.
That's a powerful message. I taught this at North Carolina State in a course on American history, U.S. history, 1865. And one of my students, a young white kid who had not been applying himself, came to me and said that he was so inspired by his story that he would become a better performer, not only in my class, but his other classes as well. This thing can change lives. Any other thoughts? Any reflections?
I teach the literature part of it, so when I just have an excerpt that I do, and it's in chapter 10 in this one, the autobiography, but it's the part where he's rented out to Mr. Covey, and he's whipped, and then he gets into the fight, and with Mr. Covey, and Covey can't overtake him, so he gets the overseer, and the overseer's like, dude, I'm not getting in the middle of this. And anyway, by the end of it, Frederick Douglass said, I was a slave for 4 more years, but I was never whipped again. And my kids at the end of this are always like, oh my God, because every narrative they've ever had is an African was beaten or killed and put back wherever. And this is the first time that they saw someone come up in rage and take control and then say, and it never happened again. And so this, and I teach 11th graders, this is like eye-opening to them, a whole different world of slave narrative.
The other thing, I love that passage too, by the way. The other thing I like about Frederick Douglass is that he names names. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's one of the first narratives that does go and says, shame on you, and I'm going to expose these people. I'm not going to keep it anonymous. I'm not going to keep it, and it put him at great danger. But it really shines a light directly on people that were known in society.
Coach. And I like this I'll say this in a nice way. I like his graphic details of what really happens. Like, for instance, when he talks about being owned by Captain Anthony, he talks about the problems he had with the drunken overseer. So he's letting you see what he had to see. The overseer beat his ass. He said, I remember being quite a small child, and I remember in detail what happened. So we get a vivid picture of what's going on. Because when you watch movies, you think, well, hey, the owner's the only one beating the slave. That's not always the case. The overseer, who's just a normal guy working, who has no value truly in the slave, takes a tougher toll.
Yes, sure.
So this summer I had the pleasure of having a program with Professor Blight right before this one at Yale, and it was the life of town of Frederick Douglass. One of the things I always find interesting is the women in his life, the role of women in his life, the role of the slave, the role of his mistress, and how she transformed his life, the role of his wife. But going back to his point about naming name and being graphic, one of the things Professor Blight was saying was that he named his name. What was the role of the purpose for him naming names? Was it to ensure that he sells? Because we've got to also remember, after this, Frederick Douglass decided that he was never going to make another dollar doing anything but his words. So it helps make money, just like a bestseller. If you say who you was with, it sells better than just, if I say I slept with the president, ooh, tell me more. So that was one of the things I was always interested in. And the graphic, that scene that he did where he fought the master over time, if you read the others editions, it become more and more graphic, more and more sensationalized. And I don't know if I can agree that it's just, because your memory should get worse, not better. So is it to sell more, or is it because that's what people want to, people circle that and target that?
So did Professor Blight talk a lot about memory?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and what was the goal of the memory and what was his purpose and the little differences between bondage and his other narratives.
Have any of you visited Frederick Douglass's home in Washington, D.C.? If you haven't, it's really worth seeing. It's all original artifacts because his second wife kind of preserved it, and knowing that he was, a person
Oh, too bad? Yeah. Yeah. It's a beautiful home with a gorgeous view. And his violin is there too.
Marissa, then Michael.
I'm always like fascinated by the degree of obsession with sex, sex of the black man and sex between, and the potential desire of the black man for the white woman in slavery and race together. And there's this really interesting, I don't have my book, but there's this really interesting passage that's just a great piece of rhetoric, which I like, it's automatically, but it's also a great piece of rhetoric throughout, where he makes the argument against the myth, the lineal descendants of Ham, if there's no greater evidence against the paradoxical nature of slavery, is that there are these mixed kids growing up in these plantations that belie the inferiority of the black race because we have this mixed identity. And I just think it's just a great, it's just so, the syntax is just so hard that my kids don't get it.
Oh, really?
But it's just such an important part of the text, and it was very early on.
What grade do you teach?
I teach 11th graders, and it's an AP class, but our kids historically don't really take AP classes. It's like AP raw, which is really push. So a lot of the kids don't have very strong reading vocabulary background, and so it's hard for them to understand classes like that.
Yeah, I wonder if some people who haven't spoken this morning or.
Oh,
yes, Michael.
I'm an English 3 teacher as well, so we do this. It's one of the few books that I read pretty large portions of in class, like together, to do most of the reading like beforehand. And I'm always struck by what surprises students. And some of them have already been said, but another one is how he's like worked out to other people. And early in the book, he talks about another slave who's walking down the road and he runs into his own master. And this man owns so many slaves in so many places that he doesn't, the slave does not realize that he's talking to his master. The master doesn't really realize that he's talking to a slave. They have the conversation, the master figures out that it is in fact one of the slaves, and then the next day he sells the guy off. And things like that, some of those little side stories, I think end up really surprising students because they just don't realize, like a lot of us, how extensive this was and how much there is to this entire peculiar institution. We're doing a simulation next week where a large number of us have to argue from a pro-slavery standpoint. I'm no David Light. I haven't read this since high school, and and obviously I'm struck by many of the same passages that everybody else is, but I'm finding myself worrying about, well, I know I have to write something about this from that perspective and make arguments against Frederick Douglass. So I'm reading it in a way from the prism of what would a racist person read this way? I'm looking for the holes in his logic or the overly dramatic, the manipulating, the propaganda aspects of it. And it's a really interesting exercise that I've never had encountered before. Is somebody who clearly I would be sympathetic towards, I have to like shut that off and be like, no, I'm going to think about it this way. And it's just been an interesting experience.
We go to that here. Next week, when? I'll be back.
They'll probably be driving back through it.
Yeah. So, who hasn't spoken of this there today? Anyone here?
I would say that, like reading some of his stuff and some of the letters that I've read before, like it seems to me, especially like that excerpt that we just read here, it's just like this original, like this knowledge is power, and I think that's such a powerful thing for students to read. And then on a side note, like every time I think of Frederick Douglass and you read some of these writings and then I see his pictures, I think, doesn't this guy look like one tough guy? I mean, he's just dumb. So like I feel like his writings and then you see those images and just that determination, I think is really interesting too.
Well, he was 6'2" and a powerful speaker. At a time when people would, a major form of entertainment is going to lectures. So, which I think is fantastic. I actually quite like going to really good lectures, but most people can't do it very well. But they do it really well. People will go and spend hours listening to people talk. One of the things that I will post, I haven't done it yet, but a scholar in England has created an interactive map that shows all of the places in the British Isles that Frederick Douglass spoke. So you can see, and it's pretty amazing to see the British Isles, and then it's just pocked with all these marks, you know, and they get bigger the more times he spoke in certain places. He was in demand as a speaker. He's paid very well to go and speak.
I just have one question about the words we're using. Last year I did a different institute on colonial slavery, and they were very insistent about changing the word from slave to enslave, from master to enslaver. And so I just wonder if that's an everywhere thing, if that's
That's certainly a big push right now.
and I haven't heard anybody, so I just didn't know.
I began to talk about that years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago. When I first brought it up, I had a lot of pushback about enslaved. But yeah, that's the language being used. But I would say though that there's still a time to talk about enslaved. You know, I have a problem using
Master.
Yeah.
Yes,
I don't
that's the one
use
that's so
that.
horrid.
Yeah.
I mean, slave is awful, and
Right.
enslaved is easy.
Right.
Enslaver is an odd word.
Yeah,
But
as long,
master
you know,
is
as long as we use slave to denote a status or status, as opposed to denoting a person. And a lot of people misuse it in that way. You know, as if and African people have always been a slave, and it was the slave that was brought to a man.
Yeah, it puts the action on the person, not the person themselves. I am enslaved, but I am human.
Yeah.
I'm not a slave. And so, but I never know what the master is. Just awful.
Pass this on to Emily for me. I want to just talk about this one for just a second, you know, because this whole notion of slave is something that came from the outside and imposed on a being. So I'm calling it conditioning. It's conditioning the mind of the slave. And of course, we've already talked about conditioning the mind of the free person, the Frederick Douglass to agree. And Douglass talks about Covey, and I want Emily to read that passage for me. We've already talked about it, but I want you to read it.
Okay. If at any one time of my life more than another, I was made to drink the bitterest dregs of slavery. That time was during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey. We were worked in all weathers. It was never too hot or too cold. It could never rain, blow, hail, or snow. Too hard for us to work in the field. Work, work, work was scarcely more the order of the day than of the night. The longest days were too short for him, and the shortest nights too long for him. I was somewhat unmanageable when I first went there, but a few months of this discipline came to me. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed, my intellect languished, the disposition to read departed, the cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold a man transformed into a brute. Yeah,
Is that the end of it?
there's another paragraph.
Continue.
At times I would rise up, a flash of energetic freedom would dart through my soul, accompanied with a faint beam of hope. That flickered for a moment and then vanished. I sank down again, mourning over my wretched condition. I was sometimes prompted to take my life, and that of Covey, but was prevented by a combination of hope and fear. My sufferings on this plantation seem now like a dream rather than a stern reality. You have seen how a man was made a slave.
That's good. Let's go there. This person who already read was very excited, right? Excited. Pathway to freedom. And then, according to them, he was broken.
Is that passage in here?
Yeah, sure. The entire thing is there.
Chapter 10.
I gotta think of larger numbers. Yeah. Yeah, to me, that's, you know, that was impact, broken, body, and mind, and spirit. And I think about our students. How does this relate to our students in any way? Students in any way?
I think it helps them. They have a hard time understanding how you let this happen to you. Why did they do something?
Why didn't they run away?
Kanye
Why
West.
didn't they?
Yeah. Oh, Kanye West made that comment about it was a choice.
Yeah, and I have a lot of students that take AP psychology at the same time as my class, and I think this is really kind of a psychological breakdown of how someone is broken to the point that they accept what is happening to them. So I think it helps our students understand.
William?
Well, when we talk about dispassion, we talk about things being conditional. So when students ask me that question, this is what I use. I said, when you enter the school building, what happens? They go, well, bell rings for me to go to first period, a bell rings for me to go to lunch, a bell rings for me to go home. And so I showed you the 2004 documentary of Unchained Memories, where they're reading the slave narrative, and one lady goes, there's a whistle to get to the field, a whistle to come east, a whistle to go back to the cabin. I said, you see how I said, and if the bell doesn't ring, what happens to you? You can't go, oh, you just stay here. I said, you're conditioned to move whenever that bell's rung. I said, I can tell you to get out of here. You're going to stand by the door. You won't leave because the bell hasn't rung. I said, so slaves, I said, if you're born into slavery, you don't know anything else.
Right.
But if you bring somebody in, I can train you to do whatever I want. If I do the same thing every single day, after a while I don't have to do it anymore. You're just doing your own. And so it's not a choice. You're trained to do it. And then you're trained to be okay with it. Like you may say, oh, I hate going to school, but you don't get mad about missing the bus. You're conditioned to do it.
I mean, conditioning is something. But that's not to say that people who are conditioned didn't want to be free.
Of course.
But the conditioning was going on. Tony, I got to hear from you. What's in your mind?
You know, the whole thing, when you mention the bells, going back to education, say from the German model, the industrialization of education, not the humanities approach to really give and take, but to rather drill, to condition and to move them, to make them suitable employees for factories and so forth. We have this ongoing debate in the school right.
Do you think some of your students are conditioned today? And I'm talking about your students, not just one group of students, your students. And if so, how are they conditioned? Yes, I noticed that.
Could I address something Donna said and then also that?
I'm sorry.
Could I address something that Donna?
Oh, of course, of course.
You mentioned students saying how could they let that happen to them, and I think there's something powerful about the visual, like if you have a Holocaust survivor come in the classroom, for them to see the tattoo, it's like, whoa, this actually happened. And there's, I don't know how you feel about using about sleeping in the classroom, or you guys use it, but I use 12 Years a Slave excerpts from it because there's a moment when he's first captured, and he wakes up and they spend a long time on those chains and how heavy they are, and the metallic sound of them, and he's pulling and they just don't end. And that moment is just like, I just feel like it's just so powerful for kids to see what those chains are like. But I also think in terms of your question about conditioning, just as a Black woman, you're conditioned to believe that your hair is ugly. And we've had, you know what I mean? Like all that happens just from the time you were born and so that even Black people might say, you know, nappy hair or bad hair versus good hair. And so it seeps into your own, like, raising of your own kids. And then not seeing representations of yourself in media and books. I mean, I love to read, like, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, and all those, they just did not reflect me as a child, and only later do I realize the damage that that did to my psyche.
Anyone else? Yes.
Well, I recommend, if you haven't seen it before, is a documentary called Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes. And if you haven't seen it, it is fabulous. It's about this school teacher who was teaching during Martin Luther King's time period. And she does an experiment with her all-white kids in class. And it actually follows it through the decades where she's done it. And she is still alive today. And she basically psychologically conditions people in groups to treat other people differently, and she shows over time how that happens. And so what she did was she divided her classroom into the kids who had blue eyes and the kids who had brown eyes, and one week she made all the blue-eyed kids wear a green collar, and she conditioned them of blue-eyed people are bad, blue-eyed people, don't deserve to sit in the same place that brown-eyed people do. Blue-eyed people have to sit in the back of the class. And she and the kids just, you could see them, and the camera followed them to all of a sudden start to treat the classmates with blue eyes differently than everybody else.
Sounds mildly unethical.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna say, don't do that again.
Well, but don't, I'm saying, this was the 60s, this was the 60s. But then she switched it around, and she said, oh, sorry guys, you know what, I made a mistake. It's not the blue-eyed kids, you guys are cool, it's the brown-eyed kids. And then she did the same thing with them. Yeah.
She does it on adults.
Yes, she does, it's fascinating, she did it on Oprah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
It's amazing.
she deconditions them.
Yeah.
It would be very unethical.
Yeah, no. Yeah. Yeah, it's
certainly powerful.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen it, it's worth checking out. And I think it speaks to conditioning. It speaks to how we accept things that we hear. Yes.
One of the things that I love about my kids is their sort of sense of unfairness when they say, well, that's not fair. And you know, the 8th graders love to talk about what's right.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really have to combat, I teach the second half of U.S. history, so what I'm most connecting to is this, exactly what Tana said, how can they let this happen to you? But what they're talking about are factory workers, immigrant factory workers in New York City. And they are so ready to say, there's no way I would take that treatment, I would quit. And so I have to make sure that I'm making a connection to how they let this happen to them, the treatment by the factory workers, by the factory owners and by the foreman. If I can break them of that, I would walk out, I would just quit by making sure they understand the desperation and the lack of options. Maybe this is how I do it, so I have to sort of start with it.
Just change the rules. Change the rule. Create an odd little rule in your classroom, and the next week create another little odd little rule.
Yeah.
And just create a series of rules. I used to do this with 8th graders. And it took about 6 weeks. And every day I added another little odd
Rules that
rule.
make no sense.
Rules that make no sense.
Yeah, like what?
And within a 6-week period, they would generally accept the rules. And then we could talk about conditioning mechanism. Why do you accept the rules?
Sure, like you have to stand if you're going to say
because they are rules,
just weird rules.
right? We are a people of law.
Yeah.
Societies operate by law. And you can change the law.
You can also do because I have students that always, as a predominantly African American school, they always say, I would never, I would do this and that.
Yeah.
And my next question is, why aren't you doing it now? What are you waiting for? Because they always talk about, I hate the police. Why? Well, because they did this and this. Well, what are you doing about it? And you can't kill them, because that's not an option. They couldn't kill their slave master. They had no weapons that we know of, even though they outnumbered them. They didn't necessarily know that. So how are you going to break it? What are you going to do now?
Yeah.
And so when they realize, I'm not doing anything now to change the circumstances, how can I expect somebody with even less privileges than you currently have? How would you expect them to break privileges? That usually brings in another conversation, bring the current to the past.
So, Mary wants to do this.
Well, I was just thinking that I definitely echo the struggle to get students to really fully understand how conditions could lead to people submitting. And on the flip side, we also teach about the Holocaust and like bystanders and perpetrators and things like that. And I feel like it's even harder, I teach 9th and 10th grade, it's even harder to get them to process how people become slaveholders or Nazis and maybe one of the most important things that I want to figure out how to do better and better is get kids to sort of see how you can be conditioned to either way. Like, it doesn't matter what your identity is, although obviously the world pushes different people in different ways, but how can we get them to see that there are external forces pushing them to become perpetrators versus bystanders versus victims, all these different things, and take agency.
I'm also curious about whether your kids, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
As we're talking about this, I cannot help but think about Michel Foucault and Discipline and Punish and the internalization of power. And if anybody hasn't read Foucault and is interested in the internalization of how people internalize power structures, it's a hard read, but it's a must read for understanding how any subjugated person has become to self-examine. I think that's important.
I'm going to suggest a discussion about Foucault over beers at some point, Charles, but I'll leave it discussion. Generally, discussion.
Yeah, Jeff. And also Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about the Holocaust as a concentration camps. I think he does the same thing. Very good. But I'm also curious about whether your kids have been conditioned to think that they can be successful or not successful, whether they can succeed in math or not, science not. Do you see that type of thing?
See, that's what I wanted to weigh in on. You had that question. See, I didn't grow up in the inner city of Laurel, but I went to Laurel High School. So all over the city, you can hear the Mason Light whistle. It's a couple. There's a whistle for them going to work, it's going to come home. Well, these kids are conditioned to think their goal is to graduate high school so you can have your diploma to work there. See, my family, we all went to college. So they don't get to see college, they hear this whistle. And also you see the guy that works there driving a car he paid for. Well, right now your parents may not have one because where you live. So they're conditioned to think their success is not necessarily in the classroom, it's just to the graduation. If you can, because they lower the standard now, a 65 is passing. So you can 65 your way through high school, you get that diploma, they still have a hire. And if you work there, you can pay your own bills. But you'll do 40 years there and you may die before you retire. But the deal is, that's the success. It's crazy.
7, noon, and 6.
That's it.
All right. Okay, so let's look at another type of condition. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, we do have, I want to let you know, 15 more minutes, and it's a hard deadline because you're like...
Gotcha. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the transformation of Douglass. Some people have already touched on it, but I've asked Eric to read a passage for me. Eric, would you read, please?
You shall see how a slave was made a man. On one of the hottest days of the month of August, 1833, I was carrying wheat to the fan. The work was simple, requiring strength rather than intellect. Yet, to one entirely unused to such work, it came very hard. About 3 o'clock of that day, I broke down. My strength failed me. I was seized with a violent aching of the head, attended with extreme dizziness. I trembled in every limb. Finding what was coming, I nerved myself up, feeling it would never do to stop work. I stood as long as I could stagger to the hopper with grain. When I could stand no longer, I fell, and felt as if held down by an immense weight. The fan, of course, stopped. Everyone had his own work to do, and no one could do the work of the other and have his own go on at the same time. Mr. Covey was at the house, about 100 yards from the treading yard where we were fanning. On hearing the fan stop, he left immediately and came to the spot where we were. He hastily inquired what the matter was. Bill answered that I was sick and there was no one to bring me to the fan. He then gave me a savage kick in the side and told me to get up. At this moment, I resolved, for the first time, to go to my master, enter a complaint, and ask his protection. I appeared before my master, humbly entreating him to interpose his authority for my protection. I told him that as sure as I lived with Mr. Covey, that he would surely kill me. Thomas ridiculed the idea that there was any danger of Mr. Covey's killing me, that I belonged to Mr. Covey for 1 year, and that I must go back to him, come what might.
Mr. Covey entered the stable with a long rope, and just as I was half out of the loft, he caught hold of my legs and was about to tying me. As soon as I found what he was up to, I gave a sudden spring, and as I did so, he holding to my legs, I was sprawling on the stable floor. Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me and could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence came the spirit I don't know, I resolved to fight, and, suiting my action to the resolution, I seized Covey hard by the throat, and as I did so, I rose. My resistance was so entirely unexpected that Covey seemed taken all aback. He trembled like a leaf. He He asked me if I meant to persist in my resistance. I told him I did, come what might. That he had used me like a brute for 6 months and that I was determined to be used so no longer. We were at it for nearly 2 hours. Cubby at length let me go, puffing and blowing at a great rate. This battle with Mr. Cubby was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled a few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence and inspired me again with a determination to be free.
Douglass transformed. Personal agency. How can you imbue your students with personal agency, with agency? Are there ways to do that? Has anyone considered that? Mary?
Try to give them, like, my school talks a lot about this, and thinking about giving kids meaningful choices in the classroom is one way of just sort of demonstrating that you'll have choices in the world. So whether it's, which type of project you're going to do or what you're going to study or whether you're going to be, in this elective or that elective. And then trying to debrief that too and be like, how did choice feel?
Anyone else? Yes, Tony.
In some sense, I think our role is to help them identify their gifts.
Yes.
And where they are failing to measure up to their potential. I had one student, funny girl, hilarious actually. She just didn't do any work. One time I took her aside, I said, you play dumb blonde role really well, but I know there's something more that you got. Well, she told some people about it. Long story short, she graduated college and she has made a pretty good life of herself. And that she reports back on that story as a turning moment in her life.
That's good. Anyone else? Yes, Eric.
The concept of learned helplessness is something that I struggle with amongst a large number of my students on a basis. And trying to instill the self-intrinsic motivation of failure is a necessary step in any process. I don't know if it's a reflection more on where we stand today with our modern accoutrements and conveniences in society, but there's lesson and success in the struggle. I don't know if we're conditioned to accept that.
Any other comments?
Sorry, I talked too much, but I share with my kids that I write for a bunch of these institutes, and I show them the ones that I get turned down for. And I've been published, and I show them my rejection letters, which are painful to me because they'll be outright like, we didn't like it for these reasons. And the kids can see me fail.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to end my part this way. And there's one person here, many of you are, all of you are terrific, but I want one person who I think is a motivational speaker. In my classes, I got pumped up. Really. So, Sade, I want you to do something. So I'm going to ask Sade to, Sade is addressing a group of teachers. I'm going to ask her to consider Frederick Douglass' transformation, his conditioning to become a slave, his reconditioning to become a freeman, his ultimate freedom. And I want to give your fellow teachers a charge as they work with their students in the coming year, Sade. So just take a moment to get yourself ready. You can do this. Get yourself ready. And I want you to sock it to them with your whole body, your whole soul. Okay? All right. So let's get what you got. We got a mic you on. You want your take. You want your take. So I'll hold this for you. Well, you may not. You can't put it. Yeah, that's right. So whenever you're ready, Sade. You're closing for me now, so be strong.
So all I would probably say is our goal as history teachers, our language arts teachers, is not necessarily to make sure they understand content, because they'll get it eventually if they want. My goal and I hope your goal after the end of this is to be an advocate for your students and teach your students their own advocacy. Allow them to learn within your classroom through the history how people can change their lives no matter where they start and what circumstances they start in. However, anything can happen with just choice and voice, and allow them to utilize that within your classroom.
Well, thank you all very much. My time is up.
And we'll